Hello, and thank you for clicking on Lackawanna College's Writing Center's Run-on Sentences presentation. Today we're going to go over what a run-on sentence is, how to identify it in your writing, and how to make corrections and avoid run-on sentences in the future. So to begin, we need to discuss what exactly a run-on sentence is. A run-on sentence is a sentence that combines two or more independent clauses without the proper conjunctions or punctuation. Let's discuss what exactly an independent clause is. An independent clause could be its own sentence essentially. It stands independently without other words needed there to make it a complete sentence. That means it has to have a subject, a verb, and be its own complete thought. So an example sentence would be, students at Lackawanna love to come to the Writing Center. When I'm looking at a sentence, trying to identify the parts of it and make sure that it is complete, I first cross out my prepositional phrases. I'm then left with students, my subject, and love, my verb. I look at the sentence again, and I realize that this is a complete thought. Therefore, this is an independent clause. Now, be careful of that complete thought part because you can have a subject and a verb and a portion of a sentence that is otherwise independent, but sometimes adding a word could make it more of a dependent clause, otherwise known as a fragment on its own. So if you look when we add that word although to our exact same sentence, it becomes a fragment which changes the rules, as we'll see in a different slide. If you were to read this, it would sound like, although students at Lackawanna love to come to the Writing Center, and then it leads the reader to believe that there should be more text after that. So that changes the rules, and again, we'll see that in another slide. There are two main types of run-on sentences. The first is called a fused sentence, which combines two or more independent clauses or sentences without punctuation or the proper conjunction. The second type of run-on sentence is called a comma splice, and this splits two or more independent clauses with just a comma. Here's an example of another sentence, or you can call it independent clause. It helps them improve their writing skills. Here we have a subject, it. We have a verb, helps improve. And this is a complete thought and complete sentence all on its own. Where we get into trouble is when we combine sentences, which you should combine sentences occasionally in your writing to make it stronger and vary your structure. Here we have our first sentence from the other slide that we've already decided can stand on its own. Here we have our other sentence that we know can also stand on its own. Both are related and make sense together. Students at Lackawanna College love to come to the Writing Center. It helps improve their writing skills. However, without pausing in between these two sentences, it becomes a fused sentence. So when you have an independent clause and an independent clause joined together, you have to do something right in the middle of those clauses to prevent it from being a fused sentence, run-on sentence. The second type of run-on sentence is a comma splice. Here we have our same first independent clause and our second independent clause, and it's tempting a lot of times to add a comma. A comma gives us breath and it gives us pause. So a lot of times many students will see that they need to pause there. You can sense it when you read it. You know a comma gives you a pause, but you cannot simply separate two independent clauses with a comma. Otherwise, it becomes known as a comma splice. So the rule of thumb is do not combine sentences or independent clauses with just a comma. You can, however, use a comma to split up a dependent clause and an independent clause when that dependent clause comes first. So this is going back to that slide when we add words to what would otherwise be a sentence on its own. Here we have an example, even though it is springtime. Now, it is springtime on its own is a complete sentence, but that even though part makes it a fragment on its own. It's got a subject and verb, but that first part makes it a fragment. Here we have a second half. It feels like winter outside. It's got a subject and a verb, and this portion doesn't have any word in the beginning that makes it a fragment. This can stand on its own. When you have a situation like this, you can add a comma, and it would make perfect sense and be grammatically correct, unlike when you have two sentences split by a comma, and which becomes a comma splice. So just to review the rules, when you have an independent or sometimes called main clause, plus a comma without a conjunction, and another independent or main clause, that makes a comma splice. An easier way to say this would be a sentence plus a comma plus a sentence equals a comma splice, which equals a run-on. You can, however, combine a dependent or subordinate clause plus a comma plus an independent or main clause to equal a complex sentence. An easier way to say this, fragment plus comma plus sentence equals complex sentence, and complex sentences make good writing. So let's go over some ways to combine independent clauses without creating a run-on sentence. The first way is to put into two different sentences entirely. So here we have our examples. Students at Lackawanna love to come to the Writing Center, period. Make it its own sentence. Capitalize the first letter in your next sentence. It helps improve their writing skills. Another way is to use a semicolon in the middle of the independent clauses. I'm going to warn you to use this sparingly, maybe 2 or 3 times tops in a long essay, once or twice in a shorter essay. So here we have our exact same format, and right in between, we're going to put a little semicolon there. Make sure you do not capitalize the letter to the right of the semicolon unless it's a proper noun, because now this is one sentence rather than two. The third way is to use a subordinating conjunction between independent clauses. We'll go over what those are on the next slide. Here's an example. We're using our 2 example sentences, and we're going to put a nice little subordinating conjunction in between. Students at Lackawanna love to come to the Writing Center because it helps improve their writing skills. Your last way is to use a different type of conjunction, and now you get to use a comma. You place a comma after the first independent clause, followed by a coordinating conjunction. And the acronym that we'll go over in a bit is called fanboys. Here's an example. Using our same sentences, we add a comma, and then we add one of our fanboys conjunctions for, in order to give ourselves a little breath and continue our sentence. It might be a good idea at this point to pause the video and to review some of these rules to make sure that you understand. We will go over Rule 3 and Rule 4 a little bit more in depth in the next few slides. The third rule that we went over is by adding a subordinating conjunction. So here is a list of some of your subordinating conjunctions along with some examples. She checked her grade. That can stand on its own. And then the sentence to the right, her professor submitted it on Canvas. That can also stand on its own. So now we need to join it with something, otherwise we would have a run-on. 2 independent clauses, add a subordinating conjunction. She checked her grade after her professor submitted it on Canvas. Here we have two more independent clauses. My brother woke me up. And then the plane landed is its own sentence. We make this a full sentence instead of a run-on by adding one of these subordinating conjunctions. Right now, it'd be a good idea to pause this video and review some of the subordinating conjunctions just to familiarize yourself with them. The last way to combine two sentences is by using a comma and coordinating conjunctions. One way to remember these coordinating conjunctions is to remember the acronym FANBOYS. FANBOYS stands for and, nor, but, or, yet, and so. Right here, we have some example sentences using each of these conjunctions. If you look on the left side of the sentences, you'll notice that they are sentences all on their own. They're an independent clause, all have subjects, all have verbs, and all are complete thoughts. And if you look to the right of the red coordinating conjunctions, you'll also notice that these are all sentences as well, subjects, verbs, complete thoughts. Now this is when you use a comma. The comma always hugs the word to the left, and then you have a space, and then you use one of your coordinating conjunctions. Because we're making this one sentence, you do not capitalize the word for the second independent clause, unless it is a proper noun. What I suggest right now is that you pause this video for a moment and go over each sentence looking at how this method is utilized. So just to review, run-on sentences. A run-on sentence combines two or more sentences, otherwise known as independent clauses, without proper punctuation and/or conjunctions. It's not necessarily without punctuation. Remember, comma splices use punctuation, but they're used incorrectly. A run-on sentence is also not simply a long sentence. You can have a very long sentence, and as long as it is punctuated properly, it could still be correct. So be mindful of that. Just like fragments sometimes, if you add a word, it becomes a fragment rather than take away. It's not necessarily the shortest sentence that's a fragment. To fix, you have 4 methods. Choose one, mix them up when you're reviewing your own essays. You can create separate sentences. You can place a semicolon between the independent clauses. You can place a subordinating conjunction between independent clauses. And finally, you can place a comma and a coordinating or FANBOYS conjunction between the independent clauses. So that ends our presentation and lesson on run-on sentences. I hope that it was helpful for you, and if you are still struggling with this or any sort of grammar issue, or even if you would just like a little bit more of an elaboration, please feel free to make an appointment in the Writing Center, and a collaborator will be more than happy to help you along. I hope you have a good day and happy writing.